Chapter 17 of Love Affairs of the Courts of Europe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simona Rusu. Love Affairs of the Courts of Europe by Thornton Hall. Chapter 17. Richelieu de Roué. In the drama of the French court, many a fine-feathered villain struts his brief hour on the stage, dazzling eyes by his splendor, and shocking a world none too easily shocked in those days of easy morals by his profligacy. But it would be difficult among all these gilded rakes to find a match for the Duc de Richelieu, who carried his villainies through little less than a century of life. Born in 1696, when Louis XIV had still nearly 20 years of his long reign before him, Louis-François Armand du Plessis, Duc de Richelieu, survived to hear the rumblings which heralded the French Revolution 92 years later, and for 3/4 of a century to be known as the most accomplished and heartless Roué in all France. Bearer of a great name and inheritor of the splendors and riches of his great uncle, the Cardinal, who was Louis XII's right-hand man, and in his day the most powerful subject in Europe, the Duke was born with a football of fortune at his feet, and probably no man who has ever lived so shamefully prostituted such magnificent opportunities and gifts. As a boy, still in his teens, he had begun to play the role of Don Juan at the court of the child King Louis XV. The most beautiful women at the court, we are told, went crazy over the handsome boy, who bore the most splendid name in France, and thus early his head was turned by flatteries and attentions which followed him almost to the grave. The young Duchesse de Bourgogne, the king's mother, made love to him to the scandal of the court, and from princesses of the blood royal to the humblest serving maid, there was scarcely a woman at court who would not have given her eyes for a smile from the Duc de Fronsac, as he was then known. How he revelled in his conquests he makes abundantly clear in the memoirs he left behind him, surely the most scandalous ever written, in which he recounts his love affairs, in long sequence, with a cold-blooded heartlessness which shocks the reader today, so long after lover and victims have been dust. He revels in describing the artifices by which he got the most unsaleable of women into his power, such as the young and beautiful Madame Michelin, whose religious scruples proved such a frail barrier against the assaults of the young Lothario. He chuckles with a diabolical pride as he tells us how he played off one mistress against another, how he made one liaison pave the way to its successor, and how he abandoned each in turn when it had served its purpose, and betrayed one after another the women who had trusted to his nebulous sense of honour. A profligate so tempted as the Duc de Richelieu was from his earliest years, one can understand, however much we may condemn. But for the man who conducted his love affairs with such heartlessness and dishonour, no language has words of execration and contempt to describe him. From his earliest youth there was no game too high for our Don Juan to fly at. Long before he had reached manhood, he counted his lady loves by the score, and among them were at least 3 royal princesses, Mademoiselle de Charolais and 2 of the Regent's own daughters, the Duchesse de Berry and Mademoiselle de Valois, later Duchess of Modena, who, in their jealousy, were ready to tear each other's eyes out for love of the Duke. Quarrels between the rival ladies were of everyday occurrence, and even duels were by no means unknown. When, for instance, the Duke wearied of the lovely Madame de Polignac, this lady was so inflamed by hatred of her successor in his affections, the Marquise de Nesle, that she challenged her to a duel to the death in the Bois de Boulogne. When Madame de Polignac, after a fierce exchange of shots, saw her rival stretched at her feet, she turned furiously on the wounded woman. "Go!" she shrieked. "I will teach you to walk in the footsteps of a woman like me. If I had a traitor here, I would blow his brains out." Whereupon Madame de Nesle, fainting as she was from loss of blood, retorted that her love was worthy that even more noble blood than hers should be shed for him. "He is," she said to the few onlookers who had hurried to the scene on hearing the shots, "the most amiable seigneur of the court. I am ready to shed for him the last drop of blood in my veins. All these ladies try to catch him, but I hope that the proofs I have given of my devotion will win him for myself without sharing with anyone. Why should I hide his name? He is the Duc de Richelieu, yes, the Duc de Richelieu, the eldest son of Venus and Mars." Such was the devotion which this heartless profligate won from some of the most beautiful and highly placed ladies of France. What was the secret of the spell he cast over them, it is difficult to say. It is true that he was a handsome man, as his portraits show, but there were men quite as handsome at the French court. He was courtly and accomplished, but he had many rivals as clever and as skilled in the courtly arts as himself. His power must, one thinks, have lain in that strange magnetism which women seem so powerless to resist in men, and which outweighs all graces of mind and physical perfections. The Duke's career, however, was not one unbroken dallying with love. Thrice at least he was sent to cool his ardour within the walls of the Bastille, on one occasion as the result of a duel with the Comte de Gassé. His lady loves were desolate at the cruel fate which had overtaken their idol. They fell on their knees at the Regent's feet, and with tears streaming down their pretty cheeks, pleaded for his freedom. Two of the royal princesses, both disguised as Sisters of Charity, visited the prisoner daily in his dungeon, carrying with them delicacies to tempt his appetite and consolation to cheer his captivity. In vain did Duke and Comte both declare that they had never fought a duel, and when, in the absence of proof, the Regent insisted that their bodies should be examined for the convicting wounds, the impish Richelieu came triumphantly through the ordeal as the result of having his wounds covered with pink taffeta and skilfully painted. It was a more serious matter than sent him again to the Bastille in 1718. False to his country as to the victims of his fascinations, he had been plotting with Spain, France's bitterest enemy, for the seizure of the Regent and the carrying him off across the Pyrenees. And certain incriminating letters sent to him by Cardinal Alberoni had been intercepted, and were in the Regent's hands. The Regent's daughter, Mademoiselle de Valois, warned her lover of his danger, but too late. Before he could escape he was arrested, and with an escort of archers was safely lodged in the Bastille. Our Lothario was now indeed in a parlous plight. Lodged in the deepest and most loathsome dungeon of the Bastille, a dungeon so damp that within a few hours his clothes were saturated, without even a chair to sit on or a bed to lie on, with legions of hungry rats for company, he was now face to face with almost certain death. The Regent, whose love affairs he had thwarted a score of times, and who thus had no reason to love the profligate Duke, vowed that his head should pay the price of his treason. Once more the court ladies were reduced to hysterics and despair, and forgot their jealousies in a common appeal to the Regent for clemency. Mademoiselle de Valois was driven to distraction, and when tears and pleadings failed to soften her father's heart, she declared in the hearing of the court that she would commit suicide unless her lover was restored to liberty. In company with her rival, Mademoiselle de Charolais, she visited the dungeon in the dark night hours, taking flint and steel, candles and bonbons, to weep with the captive. She squandered 200,000 livres in attempts to bribe his guards, but all to no purpose, and it was not until after 6 months of durance that the Regent at last yielded, moved partly by his daughter's tears and threats, and partly by the pleadings of the Cardinal Archbishop of Paris, and the prisoner was released, on condition that the Cardinal and the Duchesse de Richelieu would be responsible for his custody and good behaviour. A few days later we find the irresponsible Richelieu climbing over the garden walls of his new prison at Conflans, racing through the darkness to Paris behind swift horses, and making love to the Regent's own mistresses and his daughter. But such facilities for dalliance with the Regent's daughter were soon to be brought to an end. Mademoiselle de Valois, in order to ensure her lover's freedom, had at last consented to accept the hand of the Duke of Modena, an allegiance which she had long fought against, and before the Duke had been a free man again many weeks she paid this part of his ransom by going into exile and to an odious wedding life in a far corner of Italy, much, it may be imagined, to the Regent's relief, for his daughters and their love affairs were ever a thorn in his side. It was not long, however, before the new Duchess of Modena began to sigh for her distant lover, and to bombard him with letters begging him to come to her. "I cannot live without your love," she wrote. "Come to me. only come in disguise, so that no one can recognize you." This was indeed an adventure after the Lothario's Duke heart, an adventure with love as its reward and danger as its spur. And thus it was that, a few weeks after the Duchess had sent her invitation, two travel-stained pedlars, with packs on their backs, entered the city of Modena to find customers for their books and pamphlets. At the small hostelry whose hospitality they sought, the hawkers gave their names as Gasparini and Romano, names which masked their identities of the knight-errant Duke and his friend La Fosse, respectively. The following morning, behold the itinerant hawkers in the palace grounds, their wares spread out to tempt the court ladies on their way to mass, when the Duchess herself passed their way, and deigned to stop to converse graciously with the strangers. To her inquiries they answered that they came from Piedmont, and their curious jargon on French and Italian lent support to the story. After inspecting their wares, she asked for a certain book. "Alas, madame," Gasparini answered, "I have not a copy here, but I have one at my inn." And bidding him bring the volume to her at the palace, the great lady resumed her devout journey to mass. A few hours later Gasparini presented himself at the palace with the required volume, and was ushered into the august presence of the Duchess. A moment later, on the closing of the door, the royal lady was in the hawker's arms, her own flung around his neck, and with tears of joy she welcomed the lover who had come to her in such strange guise and at such risk. A few stolen moments of happiness was all the lovers dared now to allow themselves. The Duke of Modena was in the palace, and the situation was full of danger, but on the morrow he was going away on a hunting expedition, and then, well, then they might meet without fear. On the following day, the coast now clear, behold our hawker once more at the palace door, with a bundle of books under his arm for the inspection of her Highness, and being ushered into the Duchess's reading room, full of souvenirs of the happy days they had spent together in distant Paris and Versailles. Among them, most prized of all, was a lock of his own hair, enshrined on a small altar, and surmounted by a crown of interlocked hearts. This lock, the Duchess told him, she had kissed and wept over every day since they had parted. Each day now brought its hours of blissful meeting, so seemingly short that the Princess would throw her arms around her hawker's neck and implore him to stay a little longer. One day, however, he tarried too long. The Duke returned unexpectedly from his hunting, and before the lovers could part, he had entered the room just in time to see the pedlar bowing humbly in farewell to his Duchess, and to hear him assure her that he would call again with the further books she wished to see. Certainly it was a strange spectacle to greet the eyes of a home-coming Duke, that of his lady closeted with a shabby pedlar of books, but at least there was nothing suspicious in it. And getting into conversation with the hawker, the Duke found him quite an entertaining fellow, full of news of what was going on in the world outside his small duchy. In his curious jargon of French and Italian, Gasparini had much to tell his Highness apart from book talk. He entertained him with the latest scandals of the French court, with gossip about well-known personages, from the Regent to Dubois. "And what about the rascal the Duc de Richelieu?" asked the great man. "What tricks has he been up to lately?" "Oh," answered Gasparini with a wink at the Duchess, who was crimson with suppressed laughter, "he is one of my best customers. Ah, Monsieur le Duc, he is a gay dog. I hear that all the women at the court are madly in love with him, that the princesses adore him, and that he is driving all the husbands to distraction." "Is it as bad as that?" asked the Duke with a laugh. "He is a more dangerous fellow even than I thought. And what is his latest game?" "Oh," answered the hawker, "I am told that he has made a wager that he will come to Modena in spite of you, and I shouldn't be at all surprised if he does." "As for that," said the Duke with a chuckle, "I'm not afraid. I defy him to his worst, and I'm willing to wager that I shall be a match for him. However," he added, "you're an entertaining fellow, so come and see me again whenever you please." And thus, by the wish of the Duchess's husband himself, the ducal hawker became a daily visitor at the palace, entertaining his Highness with his chatter, and when his back was turned, making love to his wife, and joining her in shrieks of laughter at his easy gullibility. Thus many happy weeks passed, Gasparini the pedlar selling few volumes, but reaping a rich harvest of stolen pleasure, and revelling in an adventure which added such a new zest to a life seated with more humdrum love-making. But even the Duchess's charms began to pall. The ladies he had left so disconsolate in Paris were inundating him with letters, begging him to return to them, letters all forwarded to him from his chateau at Richelieu, where he was supposed to be in retreat. The lure was too strong for him, and taking leave of the Duchess in floods of tears, he returned to his beloved Paris to fresh conquests. And thus it was with the gay Duke until the century that followed that of his birth was drawing to its close, until its sun was beginning to set in the blood of that revolution, which if he had lived but 1 year longer would surely have claimed him as one of its first victims. 3 wives he led to the altar, the last when he had passed into the 80s, but no marital duty was allowed to interfere with the amours which filled his life, and to the last no pity ever gave a pang to the conscience which allowed him to pick and fling away his flowers at will, and to trample, one after another, on the hearts that yielded to his love and trusted to his honour. End of chapter 17.